She had 90 days before the bank took the farm. No rain, no crop, no plan. So she did the one thing that made her own family stop calling her back. She bought 35 chickens. Her neighbors didn't just doubt her. They laughed at her, out loud to her face, at the feed store in front of everyone. But here's what nobody in that room knew yet. In 14 months, a university would send scientists out to that same dead field to study what she'd done. This is the story of the year. Everyone was wrong about Marian Osei. And it starts with a dust devil, a dying cornfield, and a phone call she almost didn't make. You can hear a dead field before you see it. That's the thing nobody tells you. It's not silence. Exactly. It's the absence of sound a farm is supposed to make. No hum of insects in the grass. No rustle of something small moving through the stubble. Just wind, dragging itself across bare dirt that doesn't push back. Marian Osei stood at the fence line of her father's land in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, looking out over 60 acres of what used to be wheat and was now just cracked, pale ground the color of old bone. Late July, the kind of heat that comes up off dead soil in visible waves, like the ground itself was giving up its last bit of warmth. Behind her, a truck slowed on the county road. Her Uncle Nathaniel leaned out the window, looked at the field the way you look at a man in a hospital bed you already knew wasn't getting better, and said the thing she'd carry with her for the rest of that year. Some ground just quits, Mari. Ain't nothing you can pour on it now. He drove off before she could answer. She stood there a moment longer, arms crossed, jaw tight. Then she pulled her phone out of her back pocket and dialed a number she'd been avoiding for 2 months. "Otis," she said when he picked up, "I need to talk to you about chickens. There are 3 things about this story people tend to remember long after they've stopped watching. First, Marian had no agricultural degree, no savings cushion, and no backup plan. Second, when those birds actually showed up, half the county assumed she'd finally cracked. And third, within 14 months, researchers from Oregon State would be out on that same field, on their knees in the dirt, taking notes. But we're not there yet. Let's go back to a wheat field that had stopped producing, and the one phone call that quietly started turning everything around. If stories like this one stay with you, ordinary people rebuilding what everyone else had already written off. Stick around, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We read every one. The Osei land had been farmed since 1958, when Marian's grandfather, a first-generation immigrant from Ghana, bought it with money saved from 3 different jobs and a stubbornness nobody in the family had ever managed to talk him out of. He grew wheat, then wheat and alfalfa, and for 30-some years the place fed his family, and then some. Marian's father took it over next and ran it the way most of the valley ran their land to the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Deep tillage every season, synthetic fertilizer poured on heavier each year just to keep yields flat, herbicide to keep the weeds down. The same 2 crops rotated back and forth until rotation barely meant anything at all. Nobody did anything wrong. Exactly. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who haven't watched it happen up close. It wasn't one bad decision. It was decades of small, reasonable-sounding ones, stacked quietly on top of each other, until the ground underneath had stopped being alive without anyone quite noticing the moment it happened. By the time Marian inherited the place, her father's back finally giving out for good. The topsoil had gone dense and gray, closer to hard-packed than to earth. Rain didn't sink in anymore. It sheeted off toward the drainage ditch, dragging whatever thin topsoil was left along with it. The earthworms had disappeared years earlier, though nobody could say exactly when. The mycorrhizal fungi, the underground threads that let plant roots trade nutrients back and forth like a quiet trading floor beneath the surface, were gone too. And without them, even the fertilizer she spread didn't really do what fertilizer is supposed to do. The wheat took up the chemicals. It just didn't take up any life. Her last harvest had come in 38% below the county average. The year before that, it had been worse. And in June, the letter from the credit union arrived, polite, formal, and impossible to misread. Otis Delacroix was 74, and he'd farmed the same 80 acres about 9 miles south for close to 50 years. He wasn't the kind of man who showed up in agricultural magazines. He drove a truck older than some of his grandchildren and wore the same faded ball cap in every season. rain or shine. But his land was different, and everyone who'd ever walked it knew it. When Marianne stepped out onto Otis's back field for the first time, her boots sank slightly with every stride, the way they might in damp sand. She crouched down, pushed her fingers into the soil, and pulled up a handful that was dark, crumbling, and smelled faintly of rain and old leaves. Nothing at all like the pale dust back on her own land. "There's more life in that handful," Otis said, crouching beside her, "than there are people in the whole state of Oregon." She turned the dirt over in her palm, not quite believing him. "How?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Otis smiled like he'd been waiting a long time for someone to ask. "Chickens," he said, partly. What he explained to her that afternoon, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, was something he'd watched happen slowly over half a century, the kind of knowledge you don't get from a book, only from paying attention longer than most people are willing to. Chickens do something no machine and no bag of fertilizer can do on its own. They scratch. As they move across a section of ground, their feet break up the crust on the surface, letting air back down into soil that's gone dense and airless. Their manure, heavy in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, breaks down fast and feeds whatever microbial life is still hanging on underground. That microbial life, in turn, starts rebuilding the whole hidden architecture of the soil. Fungal networks start knitting back together. Earthworms return, following the organic matter the birds leave behind. And as those worms tunnel, they open up channels that let water actually soak downward, instead of sheeting off across the top like it does on dead ground. The trick, Otis said, was movement. You couldn't just turn birds loose on a field and walk away. That just traded one kind of damage for another. You move them every few days, using portable pens people call chicken tractors, so no single patch ever got overworked. And right behind them, you planted cover crops, clover, rye, daikon radish, into ground the birds had just left. The roots held the loosened soil together, pulled carbon back down into it, and gave a returning microbial life something to feed on while it slowly rebuilt itself. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. But it worked. "Otis," Marianne said carefully, "you know half the county's going to think I've lost it." He just shrugged. "They thought the same about me. 40 years ago." She ordered 35 laying hens and 10 meat birds before the end of that week. By the time the trailer pulled into her driveway, word had already made it around most of the valley, the way it always does in a place where everyone's business travels faster than the mail. At Halvorson's Feed and Supply, where farmers gathered most mornings the way other people gather at a diner counter, the talk didn't stay friendly for long. Marianne made the mistake of stopping it herself a few days later. She'd barely made it through the door when she heard it. "Well, look who it is, the chicken lady." A couple of men at the counter turned to look. One of them, a big, sunburned man named Ross Kellerman, who ran 400 acres of conventional row crop 2 towns over and never once let anyone forget it, let out a slow laugh and shook his head, the way you'd watch someone try to patch a sinking boat with a paper towel. "Marianne, I got 90 acres that aren't doing much either. Should I be calling a petting zoo?" The laughter went around the whole room. Not cruel, exactly. Just the kind of laughter that's already decided how the story ends. She paid for her feed, kept her chin level, and left. Her cousin sent her a screenshot from the community Facebook group that same afternoon. She read the first 2 comments and put her phone face down on the counter. Her Uncle Nathaniel, the same one who told her the ground had quit, came by in person a week later to offer what he called some honest advice. The advice was that she should call the credit union about selling, before she lost the whole place on what he kept calling a chicken experiment. Even her younger brother, calling from Seattle, tried to dress up his concern as a question. "Mari, have you actually looked into this? Like, really looked into it?" She had. But explaining soil biology to someone who's already decided not to believe it is a little like trying to describe the color blue to someone who's chosen to keep their eyes shut. She thanked everyone for their concern and went back to work. 6 weeks in, something small happened. Marianne was dragging the chicken tractor to a fresh strip of the south field when she noticed the ground behind her, the patch the birds had just left, looked different, darker, looser, somehow, even from a few feet away. She knelt down, pushed her hand into the dirt, and pulled up an earthworm, One single earthworm, pink and fat and completely out of place in ground that hadn't shown a sign of life in years. She sat back on her heels, alone in an empty field under a wide Oregon sky, and laughed out loud for no one but herself. Then she called Otis. "Where?" he said, before she'd even finished explaining. "Southfield, third strip." "One worm, or more than one?" She dug again with both hands this time. "More than one." She could hear the smile in his voice. "Keep going." Then October brought the drought. 19 days without a drop of meaningful rain across the valley. The wheat stubble on the neighboring farms turned brittle enough to snap underfoot. Ross Kellerman lost an entire alfalfa cutting 2 towns over. The creek behind the Osei property dropped low enough to show its rocky bed for the first time in years. And then, in the middle of all of it, Mary Ann's well pump failed. No irrigation. No way to water the flock properly. A bank payment due in 51 days. 35 hens and 10 meat birds depending on her. And now, on top of everything, a dead pump and a dry sky. She called Otis. He came over within the hour. They spent 3 days jury-rigging a gravity-fed line off an old hillside tank Marian hadn't touched since her father's time, hauling water up by hand until a makeshift system finally held. She slept maybe 4 hours a night that whole stretch. And somewhere in the middle of it, exhausted, sunburned, half convinced she'd made the worst decision of her life, she walked to Southfield to check on the birds and noticed something she almost missed. The strips the chickens had already worked were holding moisture. Visibly, the clover she planted behind the first rotation was still green, still rooted, still alive in the middle of a drought that was killing everything around it. It wasn't luck. Healthy soil, with active microbial life and earthworm channels running through it, holds water the way a sponge holds water, instead of shedding it the way compacted ground sheds water off a hard surface. The biology underneath her feet had already started to change enough to matter. It was small, it was quiet, and it saved a good portion of her fall planting. By the following June, the Southfield had changed enough that people started slowing their trucks down on the county road just to look at it. A soil scientist named Dr. Renata Vasquez, working out of Oregon State Extension Program, drove out after a colleague mentioned what was happening on the Osei place. She had a Ph.D. in soil science and a professional skepticism Marian actually appreciated. She wasn't there to be impressed. She was there to measure. Dr. Vasquez took samples for organic matter content, microbial biomass, and water infiltration rate. She came back 3 weeks later with results. "In under a year," she said, standing in the Southfield, her boots sinking slightly into ground that was clearly, visibly alive now, "you've raised organic matter by almost a full percentage point. That normally takes people 5 to 10 years to pull off. The water infiltration rate, how fast rain sinks into soil instead of running off the top of it, had more than doubled. Earthworm counts per square foot had gone from effectively 0 to 14. And Mary Ann's wheat in the rotated strips came in at 89% of the county average that season. Not perfect, not a miracle, but real and climbing. Her Uncle Nathaniel showed up one afternoon without calling first. He walked the Southfield with his hands shoved in his pockets, not saying much of anything. Near the fence line, he finally stopped, looked down at the ground for a long moment, and said the only thing he really needed to say: "You did something real out here, Maury." She didn't say "I told you so." She just nodded and offered him coffee. The following spring, Mary Ann hosted what she called an open field day. Dr. Vasquez helped her put it together. Otis came, of course. So did 7 neighboring farmers, including, to everyone's mild surprise, Ross Kellerman himself, standing at the edge of the group with his arms crossed and his cap pulled low, saying almost nothing, but staying for the whole 2 hours anyway. 4 of them went home that week and ordered their own chicken tractors. A graduate student from Oregon State asked if she could use the Osei farm as a case study for her thesis on regenerative soil restoration. Mary Ann said yes without hesitating. A 3rd grade class from the local elementary school came out on a field trip in April, and Mary Ann watched an 8-year-old girl hold an earthworm in her cupped hands with total seriousness and announce, "So the worm is basically the farmer, but underground." "Exactly," Mary Ann said. "That's exactly it. The letter from the credit union. that arrived that 2nd June was a very different letter from the one the year before. It confirmed her loan was current. She pinned it to the wall in her kitchen, right next to an old photograph of her grandfather standing in a field that was green and thick and full of things you couldn't see from the surface. All the invisible work underneath that made everything visible above it possible. Here's what Marianne Osei will tell you. If you ask her, the land didn't fail. The approach did. When you try to force ground into compliance, override it with chemicals, flatten it with heavy machinery, demand yield after yield without ever giving anything back, you don't actually win. You just borrow against a future you haven't paid for yet. And eventually, someone has to settle that debt. What the chickens did was magic. It was partnership. They gave the soil exactly what it needed to start healing itself. And the soil, given half a chance, did exactly that. That lesson doesn't stay out on the farm. It follows you into every relationship you've ever pushed too hard, every project you've ever tried to shortcut, every stretch of your own life where you forgot that real recovery takes time. And that patience, real patience, isn't weakness at all. It might be the most stubborn, most radical thing a person can practice. Marianne's grandfather used to say the land remembers how you treat it and answers you back accordingly, sooner or later, one way or another. She knows now that he was right. If this story stayed with you, send it to someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever tried to bring something back to life, a farm, a garden, anything at all, tell us about it below. We read every single one. We'll see you in the next one.